Good morning, welcome to IndyCar on the 20th of November. Now the S&P has recently released its latest paper on independence, and the subject for this one is the future of Scotland as an independent state within the European Union. Now I have to say this is probably old news to most of us, that the S&P has a policy which is that independence should also be contingent upon Scotland rejoining the European Union. And as you know, I have opinions about the wisdom of this, or the wisdom of trying to rejoin the EU straight away after independence. However, putting that aside for the moment, let's have a look at what this means. Now, the European Union, when we were a member of it, produced a lot of legislation which the United Kingdom, as a group of nations, let's say, a union of two nations, England and Scotland, was required to incorporate into its domestic laws. And these give control over all kinds of different aspects of the day-to-day running of what was the United Kingdom, and also what is now Scotland after Brexit. Now, after the Brexit vote, when Scotland was dragged out of the EU, despite an overwhelming majority of Scottish people voting to stay in, we were meant to have something like 111 of these powers retained by Holyrood. These are devolved matters. These are things which fall within the scope of the Devolution Act, and that is the Scotland Act of 1998, and that is anything which is not a reserve power would automatically be devolved. Now that included an awful lot of things which were in this group of EU laws. Now obviously rejoining the European Union after independence would bring all of this back, but the fact that the SNP has published a paper on independence with Scotland as an independent state rejoining the EU is really almost an admission that these powers have disappeared somehow or other. They were meant to come back to Holyrood. They included things, for example, things like forestry, something I mentioned in the programme just the other day. Control over forestry would have become a central Scottish parliamentary power, and that would have been able to compel landowners to reforest much of the Scottish Highlands in a specific way. We can't do that because that power has been snatched away from us by the English government, despite the fact that it is still supposedly a devolved power. There were also powers over things like environmental law, things concerning emissions, things concerning the handling of toxic materials, the release of materials into the environment from industrial processes, and also, interestingly, planning consent, not only for building houses, but for new factories, new industrial processes, and so on. We would have had control over all of that. We would have been able to stop pollution before it even started. All of that has been taken away from us by the British state, even though it was meant to return to Holyrood. So what the SNP is really saying here is that those powers really have been effectively lost, and the only way to get them back is to rejoin the European Union after we become independent. But there's nothing really new in this policy. As far as I can see, it's a restatement of the SNP's existing policy, and therefore as a paper for independence, it's basically just still preaching the same sermon as it was back in 2014, which is that retaining the powers which we already had, and the laws and the legislation which we had already got from the European Union, which were far superior to whatever the British state is planning to change, is all disappeared. We can't get that back. So those EU powers appear to be lost forever, despite the fact that we should have 111 of them. Interestingly, there was one other power amongst that lot that I noticed immediately when I scanned through the list, and that was control of nuclear waste. And how it's handled, how it's disposed of, would have been down to us, not the British state. And that would have given us tremendous power over what is done here in Scotland by the British nuclear industry. We would have not become a potential dumping ground, for example, for nuclear waste. The discharges of contaminated water from nuclear submarines, for example, into our sea logs could have been stopped. simply by having this power. Now, all of these things obviously would have threatened the British government's control over Scotland and the way it is used, and the way we are used as a convenient dumping ground for all sorts of nasty stuff, which they don't want to have anywhere near to the south of England. So that is one reality which I don't think any of us need reminding of. Now, the next item on the agenda today was a recent conference which was titled The Breakup of Britain. And I read Peter Bell's column this morning where he was looking at this particular event and wondering if the title of it, The Breakup of Britain, was really counterproductive, because when you badge something up as a conference where you're trying to convert wavering voters towards accepting that independence is the proper outcome for Scotland, is what we really need, calling it the breakup of Britain is basically, I suppose, a prejudicial statement. So already excluding people who don't want Britain to be broken up. It's a very pejorative term, and perhaps it would have been a more successful event had they called it something else, like, for example, the future of Scotland and England post-Brexit, for example, in which people from very many different political persuasions could have come together to actually discuss the future of Scotland and England after Brexit, and whether we wouldn't actually be better off having a new arrangement with England where both countries are separated but still able to trade with one another, but have their own specific rules and regulations, where Scotland would be independent, able to borrow money, able to govern itself, still able to do business with England in the traditional way with an open border, etc. But that was not what that title of that event actually said to people. It basically said to people that we're going to break up Britain. And that pretty much excluded anybody who wasn't already a very dyed-in-the-wool independence campaigner, which meant that it became a bubble, an echo chamber of the same old stalwarts attending the same old meetings. There's often a complaint that we can't attract younger people into the independence movement. Well, this kind of branding, I think, is counterproductive to that as well. If you really want to engage young people into the independence movement, you have to explain to them why it is relevant for them in the first place, what effect independence will have on their future as young adults, what opportunities it opens for them for their careers, how the country can be cleaner, environmentally less harmful, more sustainable, etc., etc. Instead of that, badging this up as the breakup of Britain really makes it sound like an act of vandalism. And frankly, I think Peter's right. That kind of pejorative badging or framing of the argument really excludes a lot of people that we need to talk to. Now, speaking of people that we need to talk to, brings me to Alba, who have reiterated their policy on general elections going forward. And their stated policy is that all general elections henceforth, including the one next year in 2024, should be on the subject of independence. In other words, they should be not just a mandate for a referendum. In fact, Alba has completely rejected the idea of another mandate for another referendum completely. And they're basically saying that if a majority of Scots vote for pro-independence parties at any general election, either in London or in Edinburgh, then that should result in the negotiations between the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament to end the Union and replace it with some kind of new agreement for two independent states, if you like, a two-state solution. So it's interesting that Alba has decided to abandon the idea of campaigning for a proper Scottish independence referendum. And by proper Scottish independence referendum, I mean one which is not controlled by the British state, does not involve any British companies in the counting of votes, and excludes entirely any British interference in the way the referendum is run. Now, it could be that Alba has decided that it is vanishingly unlikely that the SNP would ever do such a thing and actually hold this referendum after winning the next general election. And because of that, and perhaps because they also feared that if there were another referendum, that the British state would set the ground rules and would do the same thing as it did in 2014, with basically all kinds of vote rigging and vote stuffing going on everywhere, and the postal vote being completely compromised by the Tory party leader and her own one of the party grandees' own companies counting the votes electronically somewhere in England. All of that is probably what Alba is worried about. But what do negotiations on ending the union actually mean? And that's not really defined in Alba's policy. And I think that is the problem with it. If that policy stated quite clearly that Alba would demand that the British government negotiates with them over the ending of the union, there's got to be something after that, because when the British state says, no, we're not going to negotiate the end of the union, where do you go from there? And this is what is not mentioned in Alba's policy. If they're serious about this, abandoning the idea of another independence referendum, and I can see the argument for that. I mean, it was heavily compromised the last time to the point where it basically was rigged out of existence in the last few days, and the Scottish people were terrorised by the thought of losing the pound, all of this sort of nonsense. If you really want to avoid that and go straight for the jugular and say that if we win a general election with, let's say, a majority of the votes, not a majority of the seats. Now, I still disagree with the SNP on this seat majority thing. If it's a majority of the votes for independence parties, you could simply declare independence because a majority of people would have demanded it, and that would have been legitimate. Whether that's what is meant in Alba's policy about negotiating the end of the union is not clear to me. But if you win a general election, a UK-wide general election, where a majority of Scottish voters vote for parties of independence, that is a clear mandate just to end the union there and then and declare it over and abandon all negotiations with England, because we know they're not going to negotiate, and simply declare our independence and end the union there and then. I mean, that is the shortest way of doing it. That is known as a unilateral declaration of independence, a UDI. This is a phrase which, because of its history in certain other countries, has become a bit of a taboo. But declaring your own independence after a democratic vote, where a majority of people in your country have voted for independence parties, isn't illegal, and it's completely legitimate to do it. But I love to know whether that's what Alba actually means. Perhaps some Alba members might want to contact me and let me know. So anyway, that's about it for today. I just wanted to go through a few things, but a lot of the stuff that we're hearing from the SNP is old regurgitated policy being presented as something new. It's not really. It's just the same policy of rejoining the EU after independence. The trouble is that's going to take years, and as you know, my opinion is that we should join the European Free Trade Association at least as a stepping stone so that we can restart trade within months rather than within a decade. And that would do a great deal more for the confidence of people investing in Scotland and allow the government to sell bonds and borrow money quickly, which it will need to do when we do become independent. So I've still got some disagreements with both Alba and the SNP on how this should be done, but what I really would like to know is what happens if Alba's policy is successful. They win, let's say, a vote count of a majority of votes, which is a clear mandate for independence to happen, and start negotiations and find that the British side will not play ball. Where do we go from there? Because it seems to me the only option then would be to declare your independence, because there isn't anything else that you can do. You have to take back your independence. It's not going to be given to you voluntarily. There's too much at stake at the moment for the British state to do that, and it would be messy. And let's not gild the lily here. What we're talking about is leaving a 300-year-old forced union, which was forced upon us at gunpoint virtually, at the end of the barrel of cannons, under a military blockade, where people were threatened with dispossession if they didn't sign this document, and where nobody in Scotland at all got to vote voluntarily to be part of this union. And since then, as we know, our culture has been destroyed, our indigenous language has been destroyed. And today I even heard a BBC radio interviewer interviewing a chap who wanted to create a Gaelic version of Scrabble because he said the language was struggling. And the interviewer said, yes, since the union started, it seems that Gaelic has really gone downhill and has become more and more rarefied, without ever saying, well, it was because of the union that happened, because the English state forced people to stop speaking Gaelic and tried to erase our culture. So, you know, we know where we're at with this, but we need some answers from our senior politicians, particularly from the SNP and Alba, about where we go when the English state says no after winning a general election, either by a seat count under the SNP's weird definition of a win, and Alba's definition of a win, which I'm assuming, hopefully, would be a vote count, which would be democratic, and entering negotiations which the English state will refuse to take part in. We need to know what happens when both of these plans hit the wall, which they inevitably will. Where do we go from there? So, answers on a postcard, please. Incidentally, if you want to rewind this program while it's live, you can do so. You can also leave messages live, of course, as I'm talking. And you can contact me in the usual way. The link for the donations to PayPal is in the description on this video today. Hopefully it's still working. So if you can afford it and you want to help support IndyCar, please do so, because I depend on you. That's it from IndyCar today. I'll be back again, I hope, in the next few days. I'm heading off to the dentist because I got a severe toothache. I'm probably going to need to get a tooth out today, so I might be talking out the side of my mouth later on today. Anyway, that's it from IndyCar. Keep the faith, but remember, let's ask some awkward questions of our political leaders. Where do we go when the English state says no to negotiations? See you soon. Bye for now.